Ciphers is the current exhibition in the Rose Lehrman Art Gallery at Hack. Shalaya Marsh is the Lancaster-based artist. Shalaya, as I understand your work, each piece is made up of multiples and is well planned in advance. You have said your work is related to ancient tokens. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, there is a direct reference to ancient tokens in the work. And ancient tokens are just small little pieces of carved stone, which were used as a very early form of communication between tribes in accounting for trade mostly. So it was kind of the earliest form of writing. And I've used kind of a similar format in terms of the shape of a lot of my forms. As you can see, the piece behind us has a pod-like form. They're actually dashes in a Morse code. These are dots and dashes. But that reference, that form, is referenced back to those ancient tokens, which generally were small carved objects with organic textures, and they had different representations in terms of how much goods they represented.
And so when you make your work, you're thinking about language and you're thinking about interpretation, and each piece is an actual cipher. And so there must be a lot of planning and a lot of groundwork before you actually make these pieces.
There is a lot of planning and groundwork. The piece behind us, for instance, is a Morse code. So the dots and dashes spell out something in particular, which could be deciphered if you looked up a Morse code. I'm not going to give it away right here, unless you wish me to. But in addition to it being a Morse code, on top of that is a simple substitution cipher. And in that respect, each one of these forms is a different letter. So each texture represents a letter in the alphabet, which you could use the corresponding cipher, which is exhibited here, in order to decipher what those are. So the ciphers are actually laid out pretty much alphabetically. So they're pretty simple to use, and there are 3 distinct ciphers in the show. The one that goes along with this piece, there's a cipher that goes along with the binary piece, which is on the opposite wall, and a cipher that's freestanding. And they all are laid out pretty much in the order that the alphabet goes. So easy for people to decipher if they spent the time with probably a little sketchbook to decipher that. And there is lots of planning. I have to plan for the number of letters that I'm using, the spacing, and in addition to just the spacing and the numbers, I have to plan for what textures are going to look good against other textures.
Right.
So, for instance, in this piece, there was a lot of rearranging of a small maquette in order to get all the textures to visually be very interesting next to one another. Because if I just left it up to chance, I would probably end up with parts that were not so pleasing in terms of the reference between the textures and how they related to one another.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, the formal qualities of the work, because obviously you do pay a lot of attention to that. So you have to balance those two things, making something that you can interpret and making something beautiful. So
yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? I think it would interest our students to hear about how you're thinking about repetition and shape and color and so forth.
For me in these pieces, I'm very interested in the code and in kind of playing these little tricks on hidden meanings. But my number one thing as a visual artist is to make the work visually appealing so that it really brings people in. And part of doing that means being really attentive to the formal issues, to how this is going to look, where the breaks are, and what texture is going next to each other is very, very important. So I spend a lot of time with maquettes, small miniatures of the pieces, just playing with the parts and putting them in different orders. And then there's diagrams that reference what letter would this be, and in order to make it formally and visually as strong as it possibly can be. Because I think if you put aside the visual impact of the pieces for the content, both will suffer. And so in order for the content to be strong, you need to get it to be visually very, very strong so that people have that desire to know more about it. Some of the newer pieces in the exhibition that you'll see, especially the pieces Rain and Snow, Health, Block, and Key, are dealing with illuminations and using the medieval manuscripts where they took the first letter in the text and illuminated it. And I'm trying to build off of that historically, the illuminations and the way they did them in medieval times, as well as the large sculptural form in the middle of the gallery is also an illumination of one of the letters in the cipher that's beside it.
What about the idea of sound, how sound plays a part in all this? I know that previous exhibitions have had actual musical instruments,
Right.
quote unquote.
Yes.
And that must relate to these pieces as well.
It does. In fact, many of the pieces in the show are actually rattles and have a sound element to them, almost all of them, with the exception of the ciphers themselves. The codes do have a sound element. I like to put in the sound element as kind of another hidden layer of meaning. And I like to use that as a reference to language and sound and the way that we communicate. A long time ago, when I started dealing with music and sound, I was going to a lot of musical concerts and I wasn't really big into dancing. So I would watch the band and watch the musicians and watch how they related to one another. And it's really interesting what happens when people are playing music together, how they have these nonverbal cues. And that was what really got me interested in using musical instruments and sound in my work. It was the very first inklings for me that I wanted to deal with this as a way to reference communication. So the hidden treat into all these pieces is that they will rattle and make sound, and they'll make their own music as we make our own language when we try to communicate with one another.
Yeah, and they're very rhythmic. I mean, they seem to be visually rhythmic also.
That's very important to me, that they have that visual rhythm as well.
So great. Thanks for exhibiting with us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. The show looks fabulous.